and it does me in ancient time. I walk upon England's mountains green.
A very British podcast.
Salve e benvenuti a Very British Podcast, il podcast che racconta il Regno Unito. Io sono Federico D'Ambrosio e a breve verrò accompagnato da Domenico Cerabona nel seguito della 34esima puntata in cui abbiamo intervistato Andrew Fisher, che è stato il Labour Policy Director durante la campagna elettorale del 2017 e in generale durante la segreteria di Jeremy Corbyn. Nella scorsa puntata, che se non avete sentito vi raccomando di ascoltare, abbiamo parlato delle elezioni del 2017 e della nascita del movimento attorno a Jeremy Corbyn. Nella puntata di oggi c'è il seguito dell'intervista in cui parliamo invece di quello che è successo dal 2017 in poi e concludiamo anche con un po' di prospettiva sul futuro della sinistra laburista e più in generale del Labour nel Regno Unito. Buon ascolto.
Do you think there was ever a chance after 2017, after that success, that campaign, and when the Tories and the media understood what you were capable of, and then the Brexit? Do you think that was your only chance in 2017, and after that, with Brexit and so on, there wasn't an actual chance in 2019?
It's hard to know for sure, but yeah, I think it was clearly our best chance, 2017, and to think that some people were undermining it is very frustrating. But in some ways, because we knew that, I think we worked harder and the people around Jeremy were more unified as well. So it gave us a sense of purpose because we knew we had this determination to prove them wrong. They thought we're this sort of bunch of mad lefties who were going to get smashed. And we were determined to show them, look, we are left-wing, but we're also competent and professional and good at our jobs, whether that's policy, campaigning or communications or whatever it happens to be. We can do this. And yeah, we probably could have got even closer, if not maybe even just won in 2017. But, when I look back with hindsight, Brexit divided our electorate. And so there are three things I would say on this. One is, in that period after the 2017 election, where because we'd voted to trigger Article 50 to leave, to start the process of leaving the EU, Theresa May kept saying, these people are blocking Brexit. And we could say, well, no, we whipped our MPs to vote to trigger Article 50 because we respect the result of the referendum. So that never really was able to work for her. By the time the parliamentary balance changed and the Tories didn't have a majority, a lot of Labour MPs who had accepted the referendum result, who were ardent Remainers, which goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, people who were passionately, wanted to be in the EU, thought, oh, wow, there's now a chance we can stop this. The parliamentary arithmetic's changed. And they became very focused on that. And the problem is, although it was very close, 48% to leave, the constituencies, the 650 constituencies that make up the British Parliament, 400 and something voted to leave and only 200 voted to remain because the Remain vote was very concentrated in the cities. So these are, metropolitan, more ethnically diverse, working class cities that voted Remain. And then you've got kind of a strange coalition of quite working class towns, often ex-industrial areas that had voted to leave, that hadn't seen investment since the collapse of industry in the 80s and were annoyed at the state of the world, basically. And the kind of Tory shires, the countryside parts of Britain that mainly vote Tory. And those two elements came together to vote Leave. And that was the vast majority of constituencies. So if the electorate is split on Remain versus Leave for a parliamentary election, not a referendum, you're going to lose heavily. And there was no way around that for us, because if we'd said, we couldn't have done, because Jeremy is a Democrat and the party conference voted to take a more and more Remain position, or a more kind of challenging, a second referendum position to try and overturn the first referendum. And we accepted that. Jeremy, spent his whole career saying, members should decide what goes on in our party. You can't just tear that up when you don't like it yourself and you're the leader, So he's a principled person. He's a Democrat. And that was the position that most unions and party members ended up in by a mile, certainly by 2019. And so it wouldn't have been possible to maintain the position we had in 2017 unless, and this is where I think with hindsight, and you always, especially if you're centrally involved in it like I was, you always run over these things. Could we have done things differently? Could this have changed? Because we'd cauterised the issue of Brexit in 2017, our conclusion was, when we talk about public services and ending austerity, that's where we're popular. We have to keep off of the Brexit issue and just talk about public services and social security and investment and industrial strategy and redistribution of wealth, and then people like us. And that was kind of our conclusion of the 2017 election, which was a logical conclusion, because that's what we managed to make the election about, and we did far better than expected. But what we should have done, I think, in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, but what we should have done in that period is thought, this is going to become the dominant issue. And I thought the Tories would get it done and probably be unified on it, whereas, of course, Theresa May didn't, and her party was very split, and it dragged on and on and on for years. And that made everyone polarise. The opportunity for consensus just wasn't there anymore. And I think maybe if we'd been a bit bolder and said, look, this is the Brexit deal, maybe even, offered to do a deal with the Tories on it and said, look, if you tone down your Brexit thing, we'll vote for it on this basis. Jeremy might have had the strength, might have done, I'm not sure, might have had the strength to be able to drag the bit of the Labour Party with him at that point, the membership and the MPs, both of whom would have been resistant to that. But they might have said, OK, look, you've just done well in the election and, we need to keep this issue kind of contained. But nobody was suggesting that at the time. Nobody came to us and said that's what we should do. So, as I say, hindsight's a wonderful thing, we weren't to know the Tories would make such a mess of the Brexit negotiations that they'd be here 2 years later still arguing and everything else happening. So 2019 could have been different, but I don't think it could have been wildly different because of the fact it basically became a second referendum. And if you put the referendum result on top of the constituencies of Britain, Leave wins. And that's what happened.
Taking a bit of a sidestep before moving to the future. So especially surrounding Brexit, of course, the Labour Party always had relationships with other European social democratic and socialist parties. Especially around Brexit, I imagine this relationship became even more important. Do you think that the other social democrat and socialist parties in Europe, they did understand what you were doing, not just about Brexit, but let's say the Corbyn project? Was there someone that understood something from it, or did they also saw you as aliens occupying illegitimately a position?
I think, there's a range of views. So we met with the Party of European Socialists, which also later included Syriza, or they had observer status to it. So what I'm told is I didn't go over there to meet them in 2016, I think, which is the first time Jeremy went to one of their conferences or one of their ministerials. I was told he was treated a bit as a sort of weird outsider and not that legitimate at that point. After 2017, a lot of them paid attention and went, wow, you've just won on a really radical prospectus, or what's been portrayed probably publicly as this very radical prospectus, which is still more radical than most of where the French Socialist Party and the SPD under kind of Schroeder and his successors, certainly more radical than that. We had that experience, and they suddenly were like, wow, you're part of this ascendancy. And they could see what was going on in Greece, they could see what was going on in Portugal, where Alberto Costa was elected as the head of a kind of left bloc coalition. Even to an extent, Zapatero in Spain. Do I mean Zapatero? Is that the right guy? Pedro Sanchez. Sorry, Zapatero was the guy before, wasn't he? Pedro Sanchez, who, was, I think, a bit like I don't know Spanish politics that well, so correct me if I'm wrong, but seemed to be a little bit of an Ed Miliband character, kind of slightly to the left of his own party base, but not quite as radical as Jeremy.
I would say the difference with Miliband was that he actually resigned against against the party, right, when it was undermined, and managed to win back the power from that. So it was Miliband that actually, when there was moment to fight, he actually fought.
Yeah, so I would say, clearly European left parties are very different if you look across them, different countries. So the ones you'd expect to be quite supportive of us and quite interested in us were, and the ones you'd expect not to be without giving away kind of private conversations they weren't. They were quite hostile to us even after we'd done well. Polite. They would be a bit more respectful, but they were still hostile to our politics. And I think they did understand what we were trying to do. They understood the difficulty we had in terms of our Brexit positioning, and they respected the fact, certainly in 2017, that we took a very clear respect the referendum result, but also not kind of trash our relationships with the EU as we leave. So kind of try and stay close to the single market and the customs union and so on. So that, which is what industry in Britain, both the unions and the kind of businesses wanted as well. They were very clear that a customs union was an important part of maintaining a relationship, a trading relationship. So, and we can see the difficulties that's causing with Northern Ireland now, and indeed with Britain's manufacturing base as well, which has declined significantly in the last couple of years. Yeah, we got support from them, and we had several meetings, both with EU officials. So we met with Barnier and Sabine Wayand and the kind of people who were doing the negotiations with the Conservative government. We had sort of parallel discussions with them. They wouldn't negotiate, but we would kind of say, look, if we were to put forward this as a policy, would that cause you problems? And they would kind of go, well, you couldn't do this bit or you could do that bit. So we'd kind of work out what was a credible policy that isn't going to get torn apart by people who are expert in EU law, but also would satisfy the kind of voter coalition and the MPs within Parliament to kind of tread that balance. We had lots of quite careful conversations with European colleagues, both at EU level and the sort of Party of European Socialists and other left movements. We spoke to Podemos, we spoke to Syriza, who were partly in PES by then.
Let's talk about the present and the future now of the Labour Party, if you want to. So I don't know how to put this because we are not very fan of Keir Starmer. So I don't know how to put this, but I will quote Owen Johnson. He said that Keir Starmer campaign was the most deceitful of the British history, because basically he said that it was going to be Corbyn but more competent, so the Corbyn platform without Corbyn, and then he shifted completely to the right and purged all the left. So what do you think about the current situation in the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, that analysis is true. He did campaign on a very clear basis. He put forward a 10-pledge sort of document, which was a slightly diluted, but only very slightly diluted sort of summary of the 2017 manifesto. It was, all the core tenets of it: redistributive taxation, public ownership, progressive on migrant rights, talked about defending free movement as we left the EU. Obviously that he didn't do anything on that. And a whole range of other things about climate change and so on, and social justice and standing with trade unions and workers' rights that, broadly speaking, have been either kind of never heard of again, or even worse, kind of the opposite has been done, and he's walked away from that. I mean, there are two schools of thought, I guess. One is that didn't really mean it, but he thought that was the right thing to say, and since then he's kind of been, because he's not Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn came from social movements, saw his role as a Labour MP to represent the trade union base of the party, the kind of social and progressive movements, as well as his constituents, of course. But, he saw himself in that role. Keir Starmer is very much a member of the establishment. So he gets into Parliament surrounded by MPs at the end of a campaign. And if all the MPs say, you want to dish out stuff, do it, Keir Starmer would do it, because that's the sort of character he is. So, you can have the kind of, he fell among thieves kind of belief that, he's a sort of basically not horrible person. I mean, I'd hesitate to say good, but not a bad person, but he's just a bit weak and sees MPs as up here and members down here, so they count and he'd follow power. There's the more sinister view that he knew exactly what he was doing, knew he had to say that in order to win, and then trashed it deliberately the minute he got into power. I think the truth is probably somewhere between those two kind of quite polar opposites. I think he's, the majority of the parliamentary Labour Party is still quite to the right of where the membership is, and therefore he's sided with them over the membership. And that doesn't surprise me, because Keir Starmer backed Owen Smith over Jeremy Corbyn in 2016. He resigned from the front bench in 2016 and sided with the MPs rather than the membership. So it didn't astonish me. what gives me hope and gives me encouragement is that actually, even after Jeremy, went down to a bad defeat in 2019, the membership and even the right wing of the Labour Party realised you still have to stand on that sort of platform in order to get elected by Labour Party members. And so they may have shifted the party back, but reality hasn't shifted. And this is the thing, Corbyn, when he won in 2015, didn't win because he was the most charismatic MP ever. He's fairly charismatic, I'm not knocking him, but he won because there was a material base to what he was saying. He was saying, why is it that students are leaving university with thousands of pounds worth of debt? Why is it young people can't afford to buy a house in large parts of England because house prices have just ballooned up? Why is it that wages have stayed still for 20 years? All of those things are a material reality that unless you adopt those policies, you haven't got an answer to. So for me, and the reason I am still enthusiastically a Labour Party member, I've been a party member for 26 years. So if I could survive the Blair years and the Iraq War, believe me, this is nothing. I'm toughened up now as well. I've been through the kind of mill. I think Keir Starmer's, clearly uninspiring. He's not inspiring the electorate. He's already beginning to get briefings against him from his own shadow cabinet. There's been stuff in the British press the last 2 or 3 days of his own colleagues, his own appointees in the shadow cabinet saying he's boring, he's dull, he's got no idea, he's got no policies, he's not charismatic, quite nasty stuff, quite brutal sort of stuff. So he's in a bit of trouble. And I think that the parallel for me with Keir Starmer is 1990, which is when Margaret Thatcher resigned. And at that point, Labour had been ahead in the polls for 18 months with Neil Kinnock as leader, who had, again, softened the party and tried to tone down any hint of radicalism and tried to make us a very safe kind of looking party to the establishment so that the press wouldn't attack us too much. And they got rid of Margaret Thatcher and brought in John Major, who's one of the most dull people in British political history. And people went, oh, that's good. That kind of maverick Thatcher is gone. They've got a safe pair of hands in. And people switched back to the Tories because Neil Kinnock didn't really have a big, strong argument. And I fear that's the risk. If Boris Johnson goes and all this toxicity around him, around Partygate and various other things, will just dissipate and people will go, actually, Labour isn't saying much. I'll stick with the Tories if they change.
Do you think that they have a leader like John Major on waiting? Because that's what we often talk about. We don't know if after all happened with Sunak, it doesn't appear they have someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Tory party, and I have no idea how some of them would poll or appear to the British public more widely. So, but I guess, what I would say is there are clearly people that are more in the kind of Johnson mould. So if the Tories replace him with Nadine Dorries would be an extreme example, but even a kind of Dominic Raab or a Liz Truss, the kind of more head-banging right-wingers, I think they're in trouble and that'll be the end of them. If they replace him with somebody like, I don't know, Jeremy Hunt or Sajid Javid, who are just as ideologically right-wing, but do it with slightly, whilst managing to look like a human and appear empathetic and stuff like that, they kind of, it's a, what is it, iron fist in a velvet glove. They can at least appear human, even though they are horrible, malicious, right-wing people. I can't see that doesn't just remove a lot of this thing, because a lot of the reason Labour is ahead in the polls at the moment is because the Tories have imploded. If you just kind of calm that a bit and take out the main reason for that, which is Boris Johnson's personal behaviour, I worry for Labour. And I think that's what we're beginning to hear, is that there are people around Keir Starmer who are, don't share my politics and don't want to take it in the direction I would want to take the Labour Party, but are looking at him and going, you haven't convinced British people that there's a reason to vote for you. And, the election results have been pretty underwhelming. There was a set of local elections in Britain in May, and the Conservatives lost, I think, 300 to 400 seats. I forget the exact figure off the top of my head, but it's well over 300 seats. And Labour only gained 22. A lot of the gains were made by the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and the smaller parties, not by Labour. So there's been this kind of rumbling of, well, the Tories aren't popular, but Labour isn't really doing very much. And still, there was an opinion poll out this weekend in the Observer, which is the kind of the real sort of newspaper of the Labour right, that said, who would you prefer as Prime Minister? And Boris Johnson still came out on top ahead of Keir Starmer, which is quite shocking given how bad Boris Johnson's personal ratings are. So there's warning signs for Labour, but I think, my conclusion is not that this is something innate in Keir Starmer's personality or lack of. I think it's because he hasn't got anything to say. You can be quite boring and dull in politics if you've got an argument. You don't have to be the most exciting person articulating it to be able to put that across. If people can see you're genuine and you mean what you're saying and what you're saying is coherent, they'll listen to it. And I think that's what Labour's lacking. Whereas I think the view of the Labour right is if we parachute in Wes Streeting or whoever the flavour of the month is, somebody else from the Labour right who is apparently more media friendly, I'm not convinced, that's their solution. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. But at the moment, I think Keir Starmer will end up leading Labour into the next election, rightly or wrongly, from whichever perspective, because at the moment, I can't see what makes him go. There's 2 by-elections coming up at the end of this month, or in just over a week's time, actually, on the 23rd of June. And the Tories are likely to lose them both. One to the Liberal Democrats, which is in a sort of rural part of Britain, and one in Wakefield, which is part of this mythical Red Wall, which is kind of old industrial towns, basically. So Wakefield, has a history of heavy industry that declined through the 70s and 80s predominantly. And it's a seat we lost in 2019 over Brexit, but almost certainly we will win back. So Keir Starmer's going to gain a seat from the Tories. Nobody's going to challenge him for having won a by-election. And then what's the next thing, the next set of elections, the next spurt of that isn't until the following May, when you're then less than a year away from a general election. I can't see him being removed unless something very, very drastic happens. And it's not like there's an obvious candidate. I mean, I know various people are being talked up, whether that's Wes Streeting or Lisa Nandy or Yvette Cooper, but none of them are setting the public alight. It's not like the public are clamouring for these people. This is a very small kind of group of kind of journalists and right-wing Labour MPs who are cheerleading for these people at the moment. And so my suspicion is Keir Starmer will lead Labour into the next election, and it's really the job of the left, I suppose, to try and force our policy agenda on it and not get involved in these personality games about how wooden Keir Starmer is or how charismatic somebody else is by comparison. That's irrelevant. What matters is the policy agenda. And I think there's still a huge appetite out there for a left-wing approach. And I think, it might be that we can force some more of that along. And even though the party has shifted since, Jeremy resigned as leader after the 2019 election, the party, on paper at least, still has policy more radical than it was before we came in 2015. So Keir Starmer's front bench are still saying we're going to bring in full workers' rights from day one in the job. That wasn't the policy in 2015. They're still saying we're going to renationalise the railways. That wasn't the policy before we came in 2015. So, there are still bits of policy here and there where I think and quite significant bits of policy, where we have shifted the debate a bit. Now, of course, the direction of travel is worrying. I'm not naive. But we also mustn't pretend that we haven't left a legacy here. Even if some of it's been torn up, some of it still remains, and we have to try and build on that and hang on to that in this period. So it's important the left does unite and, as we are at the end of this podcast, I suspect, look to the future and not always be looking back at what might have been and all the rest of it. That's certainly where my focus is. But of course, we've got to learn the lessons of the past, because they're the best guide to the future, really, is to learn from that. And clearly there were a lot of experiences in that period. It was the first time the left had been anywhere near power for a long time. And, we have to learn from that, because maybe it'll be another 20 years, another 30 years when I'll be a very old man. But clearly, we have to pass on that experience to the next generation and say, look, you've seen how we did it. You saw what we got right. You saw what we got wrong. You saw the mistakes we made. You saw the things we missed and didn't control. We'll learn from that. And that is valid. That is important to learn.
This is especially true with the way that the voting pattern is in the United Kingdom, which is something that it's uncommon. It's uncommon in Italy. I think it's uncommon in most countries, maybe in the US, but I'm not sure, where the young people predominantly vote left-wing and old people predominantly vote right-wing, and there is this huge generational divide. So in one sense, the left can look up to the future with hope from that point of view. But on the other hand, it means that you have in the same country two kind of people that are not talking with each other. The grandma's not talking with the nephews.
That's really problematic, and I think Labour has to solve that demographic challenge. We have to find a way to appeal without abandoning any principles and kind of going, full on anti-migration or anything silly like that. We have to find a way to speak to older voters, because there is this divide at about 50 at the moment in British politics, where if you're over 50, you're almost certainly going to vote Tory. If you're under 50, the younger you get, the more likely you are to vote Labour. So, but actually, I looked at the polling around Mélenchon's new formulation. I think NUPES versus En Marche or Ensemble or whatever it's called now, the Macron movement. And again, it's not quite as sharp as in the UK, but there is that same divide. It's younger people that are voting for Mélenchon's party, or Mélenchon's coalition, I should say, and older people that are voting for Macron. And that same divide is happening. And I don't know the demographics of France so well, and the kind of what's happening with house prices and job security. But that's what's pinning it here. It has a material basis in the UK, which is young people can't afford housing. They're earning less than their parents' generation did. Their jobs are less secure. They have less good pensions. And they're saying, well, why is this? Why is my life worse than my parents' generation was? People younger than me, actual young people, who are in their 20s and 30s, not middle-aged, men like me. But so that divide has got a material basis in the UK. I suspect it's similar in the US, and I suspect it might be similar to an extent in France. It's not just this kind of mythological kind of you're radical when you're young and you move more right-wing as you get older. So, yeah, I am quite confident in a sense in the kind of long term of British politics because of that divide, and there's so much that the left has got answers to that the right wing of the Labour Party hasn't got answers to, and certainly the Conservatives haven't got answers to, that I think the potential is always there. Whether we can organise to be in a position to articulate it is a different matter, but the potential for that left advance is still there. And I think there's a challenge for us to try and find that organisational form, to try and organise within the Labour Party, to try and keep that debate alive, because obviously we had an advantage when we ran the Labour Party. We had a national party that got on the news, that was reported in the press, saying these things. Now that the left in the Labour Party is more marginalised, is reduced to, probably 30 or 40 backbenchers who don't get the same airtime, can we keep that narrative going? Can we convince people still that these are the right answers? And we have to try and wage a kind of almost guerrilla warfare, not internally within the party in the same way that the right did, but we have to wage that kind of propaganda war to try and keep those public arguments won, so that because you don't win an argument unless you put it. You have to be able to articulate it. You have to be able to have people hear your argument in order to win a debate. And so we have to keep moving that on and trying to convince the Labour Party to do it. But the Labour Party isn't just Keir Starmer. In Wales, we're in government. There's a Welsh Labour government, which is doing more radical things than the UK Labour Party is proposing. You've got Andy Burnham, who's the mayor of Manchester, or Greater Manchester rather, saying he's going to bring the buses back under public control, which were privatised in the 80s and deregulated. So there's stuff that, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is calling for a rent freeze for London and for the mayor to have rent controls powers, which again is not something that the right wing of the Labour Party want, but it can't be avoided because we have people in power in major cities and in Wales that are articulating these things and saying it. So even within the kind of framework of the Labour Party where it's shifted to the right, where Labour's in power, reality intrudes and these people have to articulate left-wing policies in order to to meet the needs of the people they represent. So, yeah, I am quite optimistic in the potential for the left. The organisational problem is more difficult. Of how we get there and how we get back in power within the Labour Party is a challenge. I'd be lying if I said any different.
If we can leave you with one last question, was about the Corbyn period. There's something you think you got wrong, something in particular that you regret, that you can, if you could undo it, you will do it?
I don't know. There are lots of things we got wrong. There were some things that were difficult because circumstances made them difficult. So, for example, like I said, when we were first elected, we tried to build a broad church. I think that was the right approach to try and do that, because Jeremy had kind of 4 MPs who had been MPs pre-2015, basically, who were on the left. Him, Diane Abbott, John Trickett and John McDonnell. And they all went in his shadow cabinet. But beyond that, the other MPs who were left-wing had only just been elected in 2015. You couldn't put them straight onto the front bench and have them think. So you couldn't do it. But I think generally the lessons I would learn from that period is, unfortunately, the left has to be a bit more ruthless with some of these people than we were. You know, that you can't build a coalition with it. And this goes back to a kind of fundamental truth of the Labour Party. For most of the Labour Party's history, the Labour Party has been a debate between social democrats, reformists, and radical socialists who want to advance more quickly and be more bold. And that's a manageable kind of tension. You can have that because ultimately social democracy is a stepping stone to socialism, you can argue. That's not inherently a tension. It's a tension in terms of tactics, but it's not ideology. When you've got basically a kind of neoliberal wing, which is what New Labour represents, that wants to keep things privatised, that doesn't want to strengthen trade union rights, that believes in the market should be left to run things, that's a problem. You can't accommodate with that. That is just different. And I think that's where the ideological divide comes within Labour. It's just become this unwieldy coalition of kind of neoliberal. I mean, there almost isn't a middle now. It's kind of, certainly within the membership, there's people who believe in the kind of new Labour model and there's people who believe in the kind of socialist model. And there's very little in the middle. And that makes it difficult to bridge. But we have to find a way to do that. As I said, where that social democratic bridge exists, actually, it's in the Welsh Labour government, the sort of the mayoralties that we hold to some extent, where there are flickers of that. So I guess for the future, what I'd say to the people who will do this again, it won't be me, is stick to your principles. Don't compromise on policy. Don't allow people who are going to wreck your thing to try and wreck your project in on it. And unfortunately, that would be the lesson. I don't know, that's not my approach. I'm a natural kind of consensus builder. I like to do that. I think Jeremy is as well. But I'm also not against, metaphorically wielding the knife and having to be a bit more ruthless when you have to, because, you're not there to try and make friends in Westminster. You're there to try and change the country and try and be a radical Labour government. And I think what I would say is one of the lessons of leadership, and this isn't really a criticism of Jeremy, it's a criticism of all of us collectively, is leadership isn't just being able to lead and be an advocate for the things you believe in. You've also got to be able to lead on things that reality imposes on you. And that's the hardest thing, is having to make decisions about things that are forced upon you, that you don't want to really decide upon, that you don't want to have to deal with. And that's difficult. And so I think, what I would say is the best socialist leaders in the future aren't going to be people who come through the Labour Party machine. Asking people like me to stand for Parliament is not a sensible thing. It's people who have been leaders in their communities, that have fought for things, that have been trade union leaders, that have been councillors, and done well as those things. They're the best people because they know what it's like to fight under pressure. And it's not to say that any of the people around us didn't. We all did, and we survived. I mean, I think a lot of people had written us off fairly early, that we wouldn't survive more than a few months, and that we wouldn't survive the resignations in 2016, that we wouldn't survive the 2017 election, and we defied the odds. But you've still got to have that ability, I think, to kind of deal with all the tough things. And it takes an incredible amount of resilience. And that's what I'd say to people, is you've got to be tough, you've got to be very disciplined, you've got to lead on every issue and articulate an answer for it. Even if it's not something you're passionate about, you've got to be able to articulate it and deal with every issue that confronts you. And I think on a number of issues, and let's be honest about this, what I'm talking about, I don't want to dance around the houses. Brexit was an issue we didn't lead on and didn't show enough leadership on. And that, I've explained a bit about why I think that misjudgment happened. But there were things like some of the attacks on us around anti-Semitism that we weren't bold enough in rebutting, but also weren't empathetic enough and astute enough to try and build coalitions where we could with people. Because I think Jeremy took it rightly, understandably, very personally, these attacks on him, because he's not an anti-Semite. And it was a way of delegitimizing some pro-Palestinian activists, as well as there being, and I don't want to make any bones about this, there was a problem where bits of the left from this is the old August Bebel argument, isn't it? Is anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. There's this kind of anti-capitalist argument that is based not on a kind of socialist analysis of the world, but of a conspiracy theory. And there was an element of that, very minor, not within anybody within the leadership, but within some of the membership, posting things on Facebook and social media, as well as pro-Palestinian activism that tipped into anti-Semitism, even if it didn't intend to. So we didn't deal with that very well. I think that's, we have to be honest, but those issues probably aren't going to come up again in the same form for a future leadership. They're not something you can learn from. But the general lesson I would take from those experiences is you've got to deal with them. You can't put things on the side when you're in a leadership position. You have to deal with every issue that confronts you and get back to what you are passionate about and what you can do. Whereas they ended up derailing us because we didn't deal with them to an extent. Lots of other factors as well, but you can only be responsible for what you're in control of ultimately. So we have to be harsh on ourselves and as well.
Well, then, thank you for your time, for lots of your time, and
yeah. Well, that's mostly been my fault for talking for too long, I'm sure.
No. We were very happy. We just had to ask something once in a while and then follow through.
Good.
We made our job easier, and thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot for talking with us. It was a great pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. So, good luck with your podcast more generally as well.
Grazie molte Andrew Fisher per questa bellissima intervista. Vi mettiamo tutti i suoi riferimenti nella bio, così potete seguirlo su Twitter perché è molto interessante per chi di voi parla inglese. Io sono Domenico Cerabona.
E io sono Federico Ambrosio. Grazie di averci ascoltato.
Grazie. E come al solito il podcast è realizzato con il contributo della Fondazione Amendola e di Left. A presto.
Ciao.
A very British podcast.